Well, good Friday morning to you. I'm Hannah Rucker. Your time now is 10:30. ERCOT is holding a news conference this morning. The grid operator expects to come out of emergency conditions later today. ERCOT President and CEO Bill Magnus, as well as Senior Director of System Operations Dan Woodfin, will speak with us. Let's go ahead and listen in here.
ERCOT does expect, as Leslie said, to come out of emergency operations this morning. We have levels of emergency operation, and the one that involves load shed we are already out of. So that part of this is over. And we expect we'll come completely out of any emergency operations later this morning and return to the normal operating conditions we had before this storm came at us. There's enough generation in the system now to return to those normal operating operations, and we don't believe we'll need to go back. Now, folks are getting their power restored at a very regular clip now. There may still be some outages that have to do with fallen trees or broken equipment that are out there in the electric company systems, and they're out there managing those as well. But any outages that were associated with the rotating outages that ERCOT had to order should be getting back very soon. First, as we are able to announce the end of this emergency, I really want to acknowledge just the immense human suffering that we saw throughout this event. When people lose power, there are heartbreaking consequences. And as a company that has a job of trying to do everything we can to make sure that power is provided every day, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, watching those heartbreaking conditions over several days was terrible. And the bottom line, I guess, while we had to watch that, and fellow Texans had to experience it, when we had to make tough decisions, when the storm came in, ERCOT really didn't have a choice. We lost about 40% of the generation that we expected to have on the system. That's 40% of the supply to serve the demand customers needed. And customers' demands were exceeding anything we'd ever seen, ever forecast, or ever expected. And I think more than a lot of people in Texas have ever experienced as this massive storm came at us. And the choice we had, we could manage the best we could with 60% of the supply. And the only way we could do that was to reduce that demand. And the only way we could do that was to have the outages. And those outages, we hope, that are ending now, served a purpose, as difficult as they were. And that purpose is, we don't act, we do nothing, we could have a much worse event. And I know it's hard to imagine a much worse event right now, but I guess as we are coming out of the energy emergency, if we had not taken that action, I'm pretty sure that we wouldn't be sitting here today talking about ending outages. We'd be talking about when we might estimate weeks or months from now that we'd see the power system repaired, and we'd still see people suffering from outages, just as they would have, just as they did under the outages that we directed. So doing nothing was not really an option to protect the safety of the electric system and get us back on our feet as soon as we could. And ERCOT doesn't run power plants, or we can't, make them work if they get broken in storm damage or otherwise. There have been people out in 0-degree temperatures who do run power plants, fixing the problems nonstop since Sunday night. And the reason that ERCOT is able to come back and say we don't have emergency operations anymore is because of the courage and activities of those folks who went out on icy roads, who brought people to bear on a problem during one of the worst weather events in Texas. Because the reason we're back is those generators were able to overcome the problems they had caused by a historic storm and get back on the system. So we appreciate their efforts as well, and know that the situation we were in was, a difficulty faced by generation owners. It was faced by transmission owners as well, as this storm affected every part of our industry. And I know we'll sort of begin the process of analyzing and looking at the situation immediately. There are legislative hearings scheduled for next week. We have an ERCOT board meeting set next week. to delve into this issue and look at what happened, and I think look at what could be better, because Texas can't afford for this to happen again. And there are a lot of ideas about how to make that different, and we want to participate in the process of considering those ideas. And if there's things we could do different that are better, we want to hear about it, because we don't want an event to occur like this either. But we also have to always have in mind that we have to protect from that worst blackout. And so the governor's idea yesterday of putting the winterization of power plants into the emergency charge to the legislature, a good idea to begin discussing that issue. And I'm sure as we get into legislative hearings, there are going to be a lot of other proposals for things that can be done to try to avoid this in the future. And that is, a key priority for us, is to avoid this in the future. However, the legislature and policymakers tell us to implement it. That's what we'll do, because that's what we do. With that, I think I could open it up to questions.
Okay, thank you, Bill. As a reminder to everyone, if you do have a question, please either submit it through the chat function, or you can text me if you have my cell phone number, and we will get through as many as we possibly can. So the first question is from Argus Media. Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. We just got the notice from our control room that we have left the last stage of emergency operations. So we are completely back to normal operations as of now.
That's excellent, excellent news. Thank you. No, thank you very much for bringing that to our attention. Okay, so as Bill said, we are completely out of emergency conditions right now, and with that, I will begin our question and answer session. So the first question from Argus Media: when does ERCOT expect it can restore power to large industrial facilities that are voluntarily offline, specifically energy infrastructure like refineries and LNG terminals?
I think, and Dan can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think now that we're into more normal operations, the workings of the market will sort of determine when people decide to use power and what they're willing to pay to be on the system. And we don't have the concerns about, as many concerns about, large demand coming back into the system. So those will be arrangements between the power companies and the customers, whether petrochemical or other industrial customers going forward.
And we've been talking to the transmission operators, and they've been working with the industrial facilities that are hooked up to their wires. They've developed a plan for coming back. Some of them have already come back. Others may be longer out into the future, over the next week or so. It just depends on what their schedules are. But we're definitely all trying to work with those facilities to bring them back online when they want to.
Okay, the next question is, does ERCOT know how much gas-fired power is offline now or was offline at the peak of the outages due to a lack of natural gas pipeline supplies?
I don't think we have the data in front of us about that. I mean, certainly we got reports that there were natural gas supply issues for the gas generators. I don't think we have anything that we've developed yet that breaks down exactly what the generators told us was caused by natural gas supply issues and what was caused by mechanical issues that were caused by the storm coming in.
But over the next, very soon, we will be sending RFIs out to each plant to find out exactly why they went offline, because that's really important. I mean, that fundamentally, this is if you only have this much generation, it's available, regardless of what the reason was, that's all the load you can serve. You can't serve more than that. So as generation went from here down to here for whatever reason, load had to go down there too, because you can't serve more, just with any kind of product, you can't serve more consumption than what you have available resources to serve it. If you don't have enough, you've got to balance those two. And that's the hard thing about this, is that the reason we had to do those reductions was because that's just all the supplies that the generators were making available for us to use.
And Dan used the term RFI. I'll just mention that's a request for information, where we'll send information requests out to generators on issues that we're investigating as to determine root cause analysis and things like that for any event.
Okay, Dan, if you could scoot into the frame a little bit more, a little bit closer to Bill. There you go. Thank you. Okay, the next question is from KPRC. Does ERCOT believe it received an accurate forecast, and can you provide copies of the notices sent to generators starting on February 8th?
Leslie, I'm sure you can arrange to have copies of the notices sent out.
Yep.
And an accurate forecast. Well, the weather forecast that we were relying on, I don't have any reason to believe was inaccurate, because the temperatures as the week went on last week and all the weather forecasts just kept declining, and the expanse of the storm expanded, and our meteorologist was telling us, probably by midweek last week, we haven't seen anything this strong in a long time, and then it just continued, the temperatures continued to drop. So by the end of the week, we were running our forecasts ahead for this week and seeing that, as we've said before, we expected to be in some sort of rotating outage Monday morning and Tuesday morning. Certainly a risk that we were prepared to manage, but it was when we saw the much larger loss of the generation that we had the much bigger problem. Sunday night, Monday morning. So I don't think that the forecast of the weather was all that off. I don't think the forecast of the demand was all that off, because we were seeing extremely high demand. And I think we forecast generation really by just what generators tell us, they can do, what's available on the system, what they plan to be running. And looking at what they plan to be running, they understood there was a big storm coming and we needed all hands on deck and all power on the system. And that's what they were planning to provide. But the storm came in and lots of different issues occurred that have now, been resolved so they can be back on the system. But during the period when they had to go fix those things, that was a central problem.
Okay, the next question, does ERCOT have any authority over the winterization of power generation facilities, or does that authority lie with a separate governing body?
Authority over that, really falls to the North American Electric Reliability Council. They are the reliability rule setter. That's a national, actually international, Canada's included, national standard setting body that has enforceable rules that can be enforced by very large penalties. We're subject to those rules as well. We're not a regulator. We're more the traffic cop, the air traffic controller of the power flow on the system. And we don't, set policy or rules. We're, really more in the business of following them than setting them.
Okay, the next question related is from the Texas Tribune. Does ERCOT have a sense of how many power plants or how much generation capacity was weatherized before this disaster? And of those plants, did they remain online during the storm?
Yeah, so in theory, all of them are weatherized to some extent. And so that's the question, is how well they were weatherized. And I think that's one of the things that we're going to have to look more at. Did they trip because of lack of weatherization? And we'll get that through this request for information to find out kind of what was going on there. I think that's definitely something we're going to be looking at.
And we've seen progress on weatherization in the last 10 years since the 2011 events. And generators have spent time and resources to prevent those sort of winter-related problems. But I'm sure those generators, now that they're able to get up and be back in action, are looking at what happened that caused them to trip out during this time, and taking measures to repair that, to address that. We're still in the winter, so I think the responsible generators are out there looking and fixing those things that can be fixed to continue to operate at full capacity when we have other events where we need all hands on deck.
Okay, and a follow-up question. Can you explain if there were any other factors other than lost generating capacity in why the rolling outages were unable to effectively roll?
Yes. The main reason they were not able to effectively roll, to put it, is that the amount of demand that we had to put into outage because of the imbalance in supply and demand, that amount of demand was so large that when we directed the transmission companies, hey, we need, this number of megawatts, at one point it was up to 20,000 megawatts on outage. The way you do rotating is you have a number of megawatts, a number of household neighborhoods that, are going to be served that you need to put an outage, and you can move those to different parts of your service territory. This was such a large block that it made it very difficult for the transmission providers to move them while they were still needed, and so it was harder to rotate them. So as the number of amount of rotating outage, or rather the amount of megawatts that were needed to balance supply and demand diminished, they could more easily rotate, but for most of the time, we were facing this crisis, that was really difficult for them to do.
I think this is probably a lesson learned for the industry, not just ERCOT, but kind of internationally, that there, as we start to now think through some of the process improvements that need to be made, that there's a lesson learned that maybe, well, nobody wants this to happen ever because we've seen the outcomes of it, but maybe you need to have a higher percentage of your demand that's capable of handling rotating outages because of the potential, although you try to avoid the potential for those kind of massive load shed events, you may need the ability to rotate more of your load rather than a smaller amount that they were able to do during this event. And to try to avoid it.
I mean, it is always a very difficult issue for the transmission providers who, when we make that directive in order to keep the grid safe and out of blackout, we're asking them to execute it. And the plans they make have to be sensitive to, you don't want to turn off circuits that serve hospitals or other, critical care facilities. And so managing around those critical care areas where you really don't want to turn off power, leaves you less and less area to execute these when you have to do them. So I think, as Dan is saying, it's something that I imagine people will look at, having seen an outage of this size had to be executed, while still keeping, abreast of, you have to have critical care customers protected, and then, how do you balance that out to make sure you can do both?
Okay, the next question is from Texas Public Radio. Climate change is making extreme weather events like the storm we saw this week more probable. Does ERCOT recognize this reality, and will it prepare for a storm even worse than the one we just saw?
Well, we do assessments of what we expect in coming seasons, and in that assessment, we take a look at, all the weather data going back. And I think as we look at, having seen a storm that was so much enormously more demand than had been seen before, that certainly sets a new standard. And then I think we'll be looking at those estimation processes in general. I mean, as we sort of go back and say, what can we do to recognize what we saw here? And how should that inform the way that we provide the information that we want to be, as reliable as possible, as meaningful as possible, but also take into account potential extremes. So I think we'll be looking at a lot of different things and working with the market participants to figure out those questions.
And probably not just us, but also there are other industries that this is going to be a storm that's apparently beyond what the water systems, the natural gas system. There's going to be a need for all of them to consider this kind of storm or beyond, now that we've seen that this kind of thing can happen, and how can they reduce some of the outages that they saw. So it's not only ERCOT, it's the generation on ERCOT, the water systems, the natural gas system, I think it's going to be important for all of us, from what the limited news reports I've seen on this, have time to look at that are going to need to improve.
Okay, next two questions are from the Dallas Morning News. What % of available natural gas generation units were offline, and what % of available wind units were offline?
Yeah, so I think we can answer the wind part of that question, and it was roughly half of the installed capacity. For the natural gas, we don't have the different fuel types broken out at this point, but that question has been asked twice now this morning, and that will be something we'll, as we start into more of the investigation on this, we'll try to break that out and provide the numbers through Leslie maybe as quickly as we can.
And since you mentioned it, why don't you mention what installed capacity is?
Installed capacity,
just capacity.
Sure. So the installed capacity of a wind turbine is kind of the amount that, if the wind was blowing kind of full out, the amount of generation that it would be able to produce. Typically, though, from our capacity planning perspective, for a wind turbine, we count about 30% of that capacity, because that's typically how much the wind is blowing, what percentage of the power can be produced by a wind turbine during peak conditions from our kind of future-looking capacity assessment. So we're really not counting. We've got roughly 30,000 megawatts of wind, and we don't count all of that toward meeting peak during peak demand during peak conditions. We count about a third of that.
Okay, and their second question was, did some cities have to increase their percentage of load shed because other cities weren't able to rotate?
You know, I don't think we have an answer for that because those plans for how you conduct an outage are managed by the transmission utilities, and I really don't think we could speak to how those were distributed amongst parts of their territories. Some of their territories have many cities in them. Some of them are focused in one city, and we just really don't have any data on that.
Okay, the next question is from Reuters. There are reports that wealthier areas of Dallas received power while other areas faced outages. Can you comment on that, and can you detail how decisions are made around which areas and when go through rotating outages?
But I'd say, similar to the last question, once we direct that rotating outages or outages, as we've seen here, that aren't rotating, need to occur to avoid a blackout and maintain system security, we issue that direction to the utility, and then they manage how the outages are distributed within their area. So I couldn't speculate really about exactly what went on as far as the distribution of those went, or what the details of those plans are. Those plans are put together by those utilities, and they drill on them and execute them. So really, they're the ones to speak to that.
Okay, the next question from Jack Howland. Yesterday, ERCOT officials mentioned the winter of 2011 was used as a basis for worst-case scenario limits. Did ERCOT consider the impact climate change could have on winter weather, making winters more severe than in the past?
I think I don't know. I thought we'd address that. I think we're looking at all the, any number of scenarios as we examine how our forecast reports are put together. 2021 certainly puts a marker down for the kind of severe weather that we really had not seen, and we're going to have to examine, everything about that, and then what implications what we've seen has for the future.
Okay, the next question. Texas Railroad Commissioner Wayne Christian says ERCOT failed to maintain a backup supply of electric generation. What's your response?
There is not a backup supply of generation, but that's really caused by the way our market is structured, the way the energy-only market is structured since the I guess, the passage of SB 7 has been called energy only. It doesn't involve having a set of units that you don't use except in a backup type situation. And I think, you know, what we were seeing out on the system as the storm came in was, say, just about every generating unit that was running or wanting to run, and you know, that included backup generation from some industrial facilities that put that power that usually is used to run their systems on the grid. So there's not a backup system maintained by the state or maintained by the generators, but that's been a part of the structure of this market, that you rely on the generation that's out in the system, and if it's sufficient, you should be able to meet your demand.
Well, and in this case, because we lost 40% of the generating capacity on the system, you would have had to have a backup of 40% of your expected peak demand, and that would that's not even something that's been talked about in the past. I mean, that number has to be reduced. We've got to keep the generation available.
And I just add too, and I think probably obvious from what I was saying earlier about the efforts the generators have made to get the stuff fixed. The backup generation wouldn't be it would be just as vulnerable to the weather damages that we saw. If your backup generation was gas, you might have gas supply issues. You might have mechanical issues caused by a storm blowing through. If it was wind, you have freezing turbines. There didn't seem to be, with this 2021 storm, any kind of generation that was immune from damage because of the way this came in over the last week.
Okay, the next question is from NBC Dallas. The governor said yesterday ERCOT failed. How do you respond to that comment?
Well, I think the assessment of how we performed and, you know, how everyone performed in this event related to it is what we're going to be looking at starting next week in the legislative hearings. I think that's something will be examined when our regulators, the NERC I mentioned earlier, NERC is certainly going to have a full examination of every step we took and whether it complied with reliability rules. And that process is starting, and we expect it to be full throttle for quite a while because, you know, this was absolutely a major event. And I think I just feel like I do have to say that certainly there are always things we can do better, but the decision that the operators made about 1:25 on, you know, Sunday night, or Monday morning, to protect the system given the dire conditions they were seeing, that's a decision I'll defend. And if the failure is in that, I guess we'd have to disagree. But I think if the failure was in other areas, certainly we'll talk about you know, anything that we did that we can improve.
Okay, next question. Some state lawmakers are saying the situation shows the state needs to build more natural gas plants. What are Dan and Bill's response to that?
Well, again, I think as we start the analysis and investigation process, there may be things that you know, people learn that indicate various things about the resources that we have or the resources that we ought to have in our market system. ERCOT manages the grid that is presented to us, and that grid that's driven by, you know, private investment decisions is composed of lots of different kinds of generation. So I think as policymakers look at how to avoid an outcome like this in the future, certainly there will be issues about, you know, all aspects of the power system on the table, and we're, you know, obviously we'll participate in those discussions as much as they want us. And implement the rules they make.
And in this case, the gas plants that remained online and weren't tripped offline either because of weather conditions were having trouble getting natural gas for their plants. And so if we had a higher, let's say, percentage of natural gas plants that we were depending on, there would have to be a commensurate increase in available gas. And since a lot of the problems with the gas plants was all the way back to the wellheads that were not weatherized, putting gas from the ground into the pipes that then could be used for heating and for these plants, there's going to have to be an increase in that process and in those systems to make sure that you've got enough gas for those increased number of plants. So it's interrelated, and you have to you can't solve the problem just with one thing. You'd have to solve the problem with multiple ways of doing that if the policymakers want us to go down that path.
Okay, the next question, to what degree do you think the events of last week are the results of systemic problems in how ERCOT runs the grid? Namely, there is not enough incentive for backup power during weather events. I think you've sort of addressed that, but I'll let you respond directly to it.
I guess, to sort of pick up on what I was saying earlier about the structure of Senate Bill 7 and the restructured market, it made, generate a competitive business, took it out of the old sort of monopoly regulation framework. And, very soon after that SB 7 was passed by the legislature, we saw a dramatic increase in capacity, right? I mean, we saw new capacity built. A lot of it was natural gas. And I think the competitive market has driven investment decisions that have given us a generation fleet that has managed, the highest summer loads, the highest summer peaks we've ever seen, year after year. So there is generation on the system sufficient to manage the loads that we're seeing. I just have to say that the challenge here was not so much that there wasn't enough capacity. Like I was saying earlier, when we were planning ahead for the storm, the capacity appeared to be sufficient, except in certain periods where we saw the generation or the demand exceeding it, like Monday morning and Tuesday morning. But for the most part, it was sufficient. What happened is when that generation was not able to supply, 40% of the generation that was planned because of all the things associated with the storm, that's what really caused the issue. And so I don't know that I agree there are insufficient investment incentives for backup generation, but I just think as you look at this event, so much of it has to do with this event and the sort of catastrophic weather and all it did to the power system, as Dan said before, to the roads, to the water systems, and where we're continuing to have so many issues.
Okay, the next question is from NBC in Dallas. On Monday morning, you went from a level 2 to level 3 emergency in a matter of minutes. Can you describe what happened in those minutes? What was it like in your control center? And what exactly led to such a sudden move from level 2 to level 3?
Okay, I'll start. I think the reason it moves so quickly is that those levels are determined by certain factors we're seeing on the system. So if you're in energy alert level 1, there are certain things that trigger that. 2 and 3 are the same. And there are responses that are triggered by those levels. And, with rotating outages being the last one in the energy alert level 3, or energy emergency level 3. So what happened is, we declared the emergency. We started the processes for getting the resources we needed, using the tools that are available to us in that first and second level. But the key issue is around 11 o'clock that night, we saw a lot of the generation we've been talking about coming off as the storm really blew in around that time. And there were so many units that had to come off the system so quickly that the frequency was dropping very quickly. That drove us, into the energy emergency alert levels, and it just kept moving very quickly. I mean, that was really what it comes down to, is that we have to respond in real time to real things, going out on that are happening out on the system. And that's what was happening, was we had to go into EEA3. In fact, the NERC rules that we responded to or talked about before that regulate us on reliability issues, demand that you take those steps, and they should. So that's why it went fast, because the situation was extremely fluid and moving very fast. As far as the environment in the control room, people are obviously aware, highly aware. When we have these kind of conditions, fortunately, the control room operators remain calm in these situations. They've drilled on these situations. Many of them are very experienced and have been through difficult situations on the grid. that didn't have nearly as, difficult a outcome as this one, but certainly have had very big issues. So they remained pretty calm, but they took the steps they needed to take, and they weren't afraid to do them because they knew the consequences of not doing them. So it wasn't like there were people running around yelling and screaming, and people were calm and doing their job. Do you have anything to?
No, I think that's a good description.
All right. We were both there, so yeah, you saw it differently.
Okay, the next question from Salvador Cruz Fernandez. Are customers still being asked to conserve power?
Now, Bill mentioned earlier that we've moved out of emergency operations as of, I think it was 10/35. And so now that also removes the conservation request, I think, at that time.
Yeah, and we only request conservation from customers when we really feel like we're, nearing emergency conditions. We put out a conservation request Sunday, just because we knew the storm was really coming in Sunday night, Monday, and we discussed the need for conservation at the press conference at the State Operations Center on Saturday, just trying to get Texans to realize, this was for real, and there really was a need to conserve. And I'll note too, I want to thank people who did, because even though the conservation efforts were not able to stop us from having the event that came, because we lost so much of the supply side, it can make a difference, and it often has made a difference when we've been in tight conditions before. It can prevent us from having to go into energy emergencies at all. So when we request it, we do it sparingly because we don't want to be crying wolf with people. But when we request it, we really do appreciate when people take it up. And we heard from people who were, and it's very much appreciated because it makes a difference in how we can manage difficult situations.
Probably reduce the amount of load of their neighbors, or not their neighbors, but other people and other Texans, the amount that we had to turn off to because we had this amount of generation. Somehow we had to get load down to that level. If people hadn't conserved, we might have had to turn off more Texans, and that would have been bad. So we really, potential that it did help a lot.
Okay, the next question is from Maya Shea from ABC 13 in Houston. What do you say to Texans who have lost family members, homes, and livelihoods? They are angry and they think ERCOT should pay. Also, do you believe ERCOT should be treated as a private company or a public entity?
As far as the first part, we share the sadness and grief that came to our state with this event. Certainly the electric outages were a huge part. Before that we were seeing wrecks on the highways with ice, or having water system issues. Certainly it's just been a very, very difficult period for the state. And I think as far as should ERCOT pay, I guess what I'd say to you is, we're going to continue to try to explain the event, what we saw, what we did, the actions we took. And, as we're subject to policymakers and leaders and, how they want us to operate. And if they're seeing that there's something that's really got to change from, looking at the totality of what we did, we'll certainly try to change it or take any other action we're told to do to manage the issues that they're seeing. Is there a second part of that, Leslie? I'm sorry.
No, you covered them both. Thank you. Okay. The next question, I'm not sure you can answer, but I'll read it. I realize it's still early, but can you give us any sense of how much an additional cost it would be for generators to winterize their facilities to the degree that would be needed to withstand another extreme cold weather event like the one we saw this week?
Yeah, that's data we don't really have. We don't run power plants or operate them. We don't winterize them, so it's not, it's not a part of the business that we go out and do. So I don't think we could really provide anything all that useful on that.
Okay, the next question from Eva Ruth Moravec. How does ERCOT leadership think the federal government responded to this crisis? Was it sufficient and or expected? To be honest, I can tell you about
the federal response that we were engaged in. I'm sure as this event has gone on, while we've been focused on getting the power back on, there have been other parts of this, the tragedy caused by the weather that you might be referring to, but I don't really have information on those. We did ask the United States Department of Energy for an emergency order. Governor Abbott encouraged us to get out there and get, and I think especially he and Senator Cornyn were instrumental in helping us achieve very quickly, I think basically within 24 hours. And what that allowed was for federal rules to be set aside just for the time that we were in emergency conditions, and which gave a lot of the, or some, I don't know how many, I don't know the number, we'll get that data as we investigate, but generation units to run at full power if they were able. So that certainly was useful, and we appreciate the Department of Energy's cooperation in making that happen and making it happen extremely fast. I know our legal counsel, our general counsel was in conference calls at midnight and 1 a.m. Working through the language on that and getting it done, and certainly appreciate Governor Abbott and his administration in pushing that through. So that was helpful. And so that was the main federal involvement that we are aware of, and the part of the process that we're involved in.
Okay, the next question from the Montgomery County Gazette. Can you walk us through when you will be presenting something to the legislature regarding this event?
Yes, there are two legislative hearings, one in the Texas Senate and one in the Texas House, set for next Thursday. So we will be presenting at both of those hearings.
Okay, the next question from Texas Monthly. It seems that other states, including Oklahoma and New Mexico, suffered the same weather as Texas, but with only a tiny fraction of the outages. Is there something Texas can learn from those states about how to run a reliable grid?
Honestly, we haven't had the time to look much further than the work we've had to do here. But we'll certainly investigate what we're seeing all over the country. I think when our regulator, the NERC, the reliability regulator, comes in, certainly it's something they'll look at. But I think if there's lessons learned from any of our neighboring power areas, it's something we'll certainly look at and try to improve from. Okay,
I think you may have addressed this, but we're still getting questions, so I will ask it. Since you were working off of a 2011 and 2018 emergency plan that failed, going forward, how will you plan to have enough cushion or reserve in a winter storm to avoid this?
I guess let me back up a little bit, because when we talk about 2011 and 2018, 2011 was when we saw what's been the worst weather up until this week, winter weather in Texas. And so we sort of set it as a marker for, well, we know it can get this cold. We know we can see these kind of conditions, and then fed that into the computer models and everything that we do when we look at forecasting and planning. In 2018, we saw some very severe, significant weather that year that rivaled 2011 a little bit, but the system managed to go through it, and we felt like some improvements had been made across the system since 2011, and we're encouraged by that. So it wasn't that there were models, I guess, or market structures or anything that were 2011 and 2018 were not ways of managing the system. The system is managed according to law and regulation, federal and state, and those regulations are updated at certain intervals, and we implement those. So I think we were operating the system, we believe, according to those mandates, and I don't think there was really a 2011 or 2018 plan that I'm aware of that said any different.
Okay, next question. When the governor ordered the natural gas operators to stop sending natural gas out of the state, how much impact did that have on a comeback?
That's something that I think you probably need to talk to the gas generators about, because those supplier relationships between the gas and the gas generators, they're the ones that are going to know what they received. I think certainly opening up more supply, as the governor tried to do, definitely could have had a significant impact on the ability of these generators who came back and recovered and helped us get out of emergency conditions. Certainly could have helped them, absolutely, but we just don't have the data to measure that.
Okay, next question from Matt DeGrude. What was the purpose of raising megawatt prices? I know you said you hadn't seen evidence generators were withholding power, but did you all search for evidence of that?
Raising megawatt price. Well, I guess I'll start in with the way that the wholesale pricing, this isn't retail, end user customer pricing, but the way the wholesale pricing of power works in ERCOT generally is that we pay more when we have scarcity conditions. So on a day when there's no scarcity whatsoever, prices will be lower, but as the conditions get tight and we realize, we're needing more power on the system, then the computer systems that run this are programmed to automatically send out a new price signal that says, this is what you'll get paid if you produce now. And so plants that are not wanting to run at one price level will wait for that other price signal that's higher, and then they'll come on. And I think when the Public Utility Commission has set up the rules for how scarcity pricing works and evolved them over time, they've seen that when we get to the higher levels of scarcity pricing, it's very effective. Because not only do the generators pay attention because there's an incentive to do so, but they pay attention because if you say you're going to produce at that price and you don't, there's significant financial consequences for it. So that scarcity pricing mechanism is what we sort of rely on generally. And so as you see those prices in the wholesale market get higher, it's usually going to be related to the fact that we had tight conditions, and that's the incentive we want to make sure people have to respond.
Okay, next question. A state lawmaker says these issues aren't new. We saw them in 2011. How hard will you and ERCOT push to make sure changes are made to keep this from happening again?
Well, we do not want this to happen again. Any effort, whether, wherever it happens, we're happy to participate in figuring out solutions that keep us from this sort of thing. The fundamental physical fact that you do not want your, as Dan's been saying, your supply and demand to get too out of balance, and avoiding a blackout that can last weeks, months, we don't really know how long. It all depends on the conditions that get uncontrolled. That's a fundamental tenet because it's just too difficult to try to repair one of those if you don't have to. If you have controls that can keep it from happening. So I think that's going to be a fundamental objective. But then I think this phenomenon we saw here of having to reduce demand such that, as we've talked about, outages couldn't rotate because the number of outages was as large as it was to contain the problem. I think that's certainly something that people need to be creative, including us, be creative and think about how to manage that, because that was one of the big challenges here in Texas was, we had told people about rotating outages, but then they couldn't rotate. And then it's like, well, what's going on here? And that's certainly part of the frustration and difficulty of it. But until that number of megawatts have been, put in outage, it wasn't clear that that was going to be a problem. But once the transmission providers had to implement it, it was a very big problem.
Okay, the next question is from Eleanor with the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. Governor Greg Abbott has called on state lawmakers to mandate the weatherization of power generators. Is this something ERCOT supports, and what specific measures would you all like to see implemented for weatherization?
I think it was a really productive step to get the legislature, to direct the legislature, encourage them to look at that right away on an emergency basis, because we have been through an extraordinarily difficult, we're still going through through Texas in the power, water, and in all these areas, extraordinary emergency situation, and it's worth getting on the question of how do we prevent this in the future right away. So I think suggesting that we look at those weatherization rules is a great idea. I think the specific measures, it kind of comes back to, we were talking about in earlier questions, where we don't run power plants. We don't pretend to know what's the best thing to do in a particular kind of wind turbine, gas turbine, nuclear plant. There are experts in that, and they work at the power plants in Texas. Those are the ones who got out in the middle of the night and fixed the plants and got us back in business. So I think really, you know, working with those folks who have the expertise on the specific measures, that part you asked about, I think is really, you know, a good place to look and determine, you know, what makes the most sense.
Okay, another follow-up from Texas Monthly. Had there been a full blackout of the sort ERCOT was working to avoid, what would the procedure have been for resuming power from that? Please walk us through the steps that would have been involved.
Now, I'm going to let Dan handle that. It's a process called Black Start, and I'll tell you that we have never had to do it in Texas. It's had to be done in other regions, but I'll let Dan kind of walk through our process on it.
Yeah, so we actually, although we absolutely hope that never happens, we actually have a plan in place to restart the system if it ever went black, and actually we drill on that plan with the transmission operators, the generation operators once a year. So it would be very painful, as Bill's been saying, but there is a plan to do it, and it starts with starting up diesel generators at specific power plants around the state. Those are used then to energize lines to energize certain other power plants, and then gradually adding load customers around the power plant, starting to energize transmission lines, adding customers around power plants, and building it out from each of these 12 sites around the state, starting to build out. And there's a whole lot of switching of transmission lines has to go on. You have to open all the breakers in a substation and then close in on a particular path, close in on another path. Ultimately, over time, you link all 12 of these islands together. And then once you get those, you have to open other lines and start to add more load back and add more generation back, and it's just an incredibly difficult process and takes time. And at all points in time, you're having to balance. As you add each generator back, you're adding load. You've got to inch up, and maintain that balance all the time so that the generators don't trip offline. And what we've seen in some of the simulations is that what happens, there'll be a go back. You'll actually start to build the system back, and then that island will trip back out. And then you have to go inch back up again, and gradually you get the whole system built back. But and there are other things that will trip generators out too. You've got to maintain the voltage on the system. And I'm kind of being a nerdy engineer here, but that's to describe just how difficult that is. And it's a process, although we have a plan for it, just in case, we don't ever want to do it.
And it requires, you know, a lot of personnel being out at places and doing physical connections and doing all this when the power's not on.
And it's icy in this case.
And it's icy in this case if we had to start that process this week. So it's, yeah, it's not a simple process. But there is one, and again, that's why we drill on it in case we ever get into that situation. But that's exactly the kind of thing we wanted to avoid, you know, early Monday morning.
Yeah. From Mark Watson at Platts, how low did the frequency dip on Monday morning? He saw that it might have gone as low as 59.3.
It was a hair above 59.93, yeah.
59.3.
I'm sorry, 59.33 or 32 or something like that, yeah.
And it's supposed to be at 60, and there's not a very big tolerance. It's not like it was at 60. Well, why didn't you just let it go to 30? Like, what? You might explain actually, like 50. You said 59.3 is low. Let's put that in some context about what would have happened if it had gone to 59.1 or 58 or.
Yeah, if that frequency goes down too far, then generating units aren't designed to operate at those low frequencies, and so that if you let that supply imbalance, the generators start tripping loads up here. Generators, maybe off the scale, generators start tripping load. You have to get the load down to that level and keep it balanced. As generators continue to trip, if that frequency gets too low, that in it of itself actually causes more generators to trip offline, which makes the frequency go lower and more generators trip. It's what's called a cascade. And so there is a safety net where some of that load shed would have happened automatically. But if you continue to lose generators or you lose too much potentially too fast before that automated load shed happens, the safety net might not have caught us. And so that's really the kind of the process of what could have happened.
Okay.
And part of Mark, the other thing is, 59.3 is low, but it's fed there because of the speed of the activities we were seeing, just like the question earlier about why did we go into energy emergency alert so fast. It was the dynamics of the system were shifting so fast with this horrendous weather coming in, generators dropping off, and as the weather came in, the load continuing to increase. So it was that, combination of things that were going very quickly that took it down there, but that's when they had to act.
And ultimately, as I said earlier, as generation tripped offline, that's all the load we can serve. There is nothing you can do to serve more load if that's all the supply you've got. So as supply continued to decrease as these generators tripped off, it's physics. You can't serve more load than the amount of generation that's available on the system. And so for whatever reason these generators were tripping offline, we've talked a lot about the reasons, you still can't serve more load than the amount of supply you've got. It's physically impossible. And so regardless of what the mechanism is by which the load gets, whether it's us doing it in a controlled way the way we did, whether it's this safety net tripping the load off or whatever, you're going to get down to the level that you've got generation to serve it. And for as long as you only have that amount of generation, you can't serve more load. And so that's really part of the problem.
I mean, it's kind of like if you said, you plan to take a 50-mile drive, but the gas you had in your car would only get you 10, you're taking a 10-mile drive. I mean, so if we had done nothing when we saw that much generation come off, we would have tripped into all these problems Dan's talked about. But if we'd done nothing, there still would have been an enormous amount of outages. Because if the only available generation at that point in that night was, I don't know, say 45,000 megawatts. Don't quote me on the number, but if it was that much, then we could serve demand up to 45,000 megawatts, but the demand was much higher. So one way or the other,
if everybody was hooked up, if all the lines were energized, all the consumers were in, the demand would have been much higher.
Yeah, so that's a limit on the system.
Okay, we're about at 11:30, so I think what I'll do is I'll just go ahead and try to ask maybe 2 more questions, and then Bill, if you want to make any final remarks before we conclude that call, I will turn it over to you for that. The next question that I'm seeing is, depending on what you find in those RFI investigations, who has regulatory power to take action on the findings?
Yeah. I think we'll have to, I don't know that there is any one, it depends on what the finding is, I guess. If there are things, the North American Electric Reliability Council, or NERC, has certain, has lots of reliability standards where all the different operating entities in the electric system, generators, transmission owners, ERCOT, all have to meet. And so if there's something that happens that was in violation of one of those standards, then NERC and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission would have regulatory authority over that. If there's something that folks did that was in violation of the ERCOT protocols, that would be the Public Utility Commission and the legislature that would have kind of a regulatory oversight over things that are violations of the protocols. And so I think those are the two real entities there.
Well, I should add too, since we're talking about requests for information, RFIs, we ask those to get information too. I mean, it's not so much to find violations on our part, because when there's events like this, there are market participant groups made up of experts, many of which have tons of experience, particularly in our market, and we take these event analysis to them, and they're even more technical than he's talking today, and go into tremendous detail about what we saw. So that, people rely on us to have the ability to gather everyone's information, and when it's confidential, keep it confidential, but still be able to make these examinations and do the lessons learned. And we participate in that, but we have market participants who are generators, transmission providers, retail providers, all across the board, who are meeting regularly in difficult times and good times, because the market continues to shift and evolve, and we really rely on our relationships with them to develop better practices. So, as Dan's saying, I mean, if information ends up being a violation of a federal or state standard, well, that's something somebody has to deal with in the federal or state standard. But we want the information anyway, because it builds a data set that lets us do analysis and make the kind of improvements that we've been talking about.
Okay, I may ask two more. What is the distinction between ending the rotating outages and ending emergency operations? What does returning to normal operations mean?
There are certain things we ask for when we are in an emergency level 1, for example, that are not rotating outages. Basically, the way the energy emergency alert levels work is you're getting down into, could be a dangerous position, and so you do things. We have programs where there are certain entities that receive a payment to take their load off voluntarily, right? Called Emergency Response Service. And when we give them the call, when we're in an energy emergency alert level 2, then they're obligated, and there's big penalties if they don't. They're obligated to come off the system voluntarily to help, get the supply and demand in balance. There's something called load resources, which again is another demand side set of resources that we take off the system. And so each one, and requesting conservation, for example, is an EEA level request. So there are things that we do instantaneously once we get into one of those levels. And often, we've been in EEA 1 before and then dropped back. We've been in EEA 2 before and dropped back into regular operations. So they really do help resolve problems before you get into the worst outcome. But that's sort of the structure of how it goes. And I know there was a second part of that one that I'm not getting.
I think the question was, what does it mean to return to normal operations?
Sorry, yes, that's it. So when we talk about normal operations, we're not asking for any of those out-of-market, responses like, we need you to conserve, or we want you to voluntarily reduce your load, or all of those mechanisms are tools. They're tools that we have in place for when we need them to try to protect the system. And so we're basically saying we think the conditions now are like they were a week ago, like they were 2 weeks ago, where you're not noticing anything about your electricity because the system is stable, generation is able to serve at the level demanded by demand or load, and there's nothing to see here, there's nothing we're asking people to do. And in ordinary operations, well, I should add, I want to be sure to add, as Dan just pointed out, in ordinary, we're still having people return to service, right? We are not asking for additional load shed. We're not asking for additional measures, but just to be sure I'm clear, the transmission providers out there who are getting people back into service are still at work on restoring the last of the rotating outages that are still out, as well as working on things that had nothing to do with rotating outages, but were storm damage, like ice or other issues. So I want to be real clear on that. It doesn't mean that part's over. That's still underway. But typically in ordinary operations, what we mean is ERCOT, as the grid operator, is not asking people to do these things to protect the integrity of the grid. So really what goes on most of the time is we are watching the balance of the system and managing issues as they come up, like, if a transmission line goes out of service and we have to readjust how the electricity is flowing, we're working with them on that. If a generating unit that's large drops off and threatens the balance, even though it may not threaten entire reliability, we work on that and how to replace that. So we're constantly, 24/7 managing various types of issues on the system. And they're with generation, they're with load. Like, for example, one of the ones we've been challenged with over the past 10 years now is intermittent resources that are different than other resources on the system. We've had to learn how to balance with some resources that are on and then off and then on, and we can't really control them like you can a traditional, machine, like a coal plant or a nuclear or gas plant. So constantly monitoring, measuring, doing all those things, but most days it's completely in the background because the system is stable, everybody's doing what they need to do, and the transactions that manage the market are private transactions in a marketplace where people, have profit motives, but people are limited by the things we need to serve the system. That's basically why, you really only hear from us if the general public only hears about ERCOT if it's bad news, because we're the ones who do have to step in and direct that things happen to make those worst things not happen. And so that's what we did this week. Now that we're in ordinary operations, we're hoping that we stay there for quite a while and we can just manage the challenges on the system that exist every day, but not manage the kind of challenge that had such a cataclysmic effect as we've seen all over the state and continue to see this week.
Okay, well, thank you, Bill and Dan. And I know several of you have messaged me about wanting to see those operations messages that went out prior to the storm hitting. If you go to the homepage of the ERCOT website, ERCOT.com, and then you scroll down to the bottom of the page, you'll see a market communication button, and down there you can select operations messages, and from there you can pull up all of the messages and notices that we sent out prior to this event hitting us. So I think with that we will conclude this call, and we appreciate you taking the time to listen in, and I think Bill might have one more final remark. So Bill.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I just, since we're emerging from emergency operations, I think this will be the last of these updating calls. And I'd just like to personally thank everybody who has participated in watching these. Like everything else, how we communicate will be subject to review and discussion. And if we haven't done that effectively, that's certainly on us. But I really appreciate everybody who's taken the time to get these updates. I hope they provided you useful information as we've worked through this crisis, and hope it's made it, at least more understandable, if not more acceptable, that we've been in this. And so just want to thank everybody for keeping up with this and as we try to keep the public informed. So thanks.
All right. Thank you all very much. And this will conclude our call. Thank you.
Wrapping up there, Texas can't afford for this to happen again. That is a message just now from ERCOT President and CEO Bill Magnus, as well as Senior Director of System Operations Dan Woodfin, giving an update for us there. Thousands are regaining power right now across our viewing area as ERCOT has just completed the final stage of emergency operations. Austin Energy has restored power to all but 5% of customers. ERCOT says legislative hearing schedules next week, and they will take a closer look exactly what went wrong this week. They also mentioned the immense human suffering through this event that they saw. And we want to hear from you guys today. Be sure to message us. Let us know if your power's coming back on. We really just want to be able to share your stories over the next few days as we continue to get through this. And we know that things are going to get a little bit warmer in our area starting today as far as weather goes. But we have 3 big issues impacting our area right now. We just got that update about power, but still the low supply of food at grocery stores and a water crisis all remain a main concern for Texans today and for the next few days at the very least. Millions of Texans across the state still need to boil their water today, including these Central Texas communities: Austin, Travis County, Aqua Water Supply customers in Bastrop, Buda, Coupland, parts of Georgetown, Plum Creek, Leander, Pflugerville, San Marcos, and Thorndale. So certainly shows how many people are being impacted by this. KVUE's Tori Larnett is tracking the water emergency in our state. Tori, what is the latest? I know you've been looking at this all morning for us.
Hey, good morning, Hannah. Yeah, the situation in Austin as far as water goes hasn't gotten quite better for who has it. We know that Cruz with Austin Water are working around the clock to make it happen, but as of now, a lot of people still without water. We do have an update from them, though, this morning. Take a look at your screen. This is a graph that they released in regards to what they need to do to get water fully operational again. This graph shows where we are at in terms of water production, customer demand, and how much water the city has stored. A healthy water system should have a minimum of 100 million gallons of water in storage. Right now, Austin Water has 32 million gallons of water, but that number is climbing. That's the good news. Now, this is the second thing I wanted to show you. This map shows where the problem areas are in the city. Areas in red have no water. Areas in orange have low pressure. The goal is to get to green again, meaning the system is operating normally. That's when the boil water notice will get lifted. Here's the thing, though. Don't expect everyone to get water at once. With so many outages, Austin Energy can't turn everyone's water back on at once safely. They have to make sure it doesn't overload the system and cause more outages. They're also asking that until the system gets back to normal for people to continue to conserve water and only use it for essential resources. We do know that extra resources are on the way, including food and water. Once we figure out what that distribution will look like, we'll keep you updated. Meanwhile, we do know a lot of people don't have water right now. That's why we've put together a list of resources on KVUE.com for places you can go around town to get fresh drinking water. Again, go to KVUE.com for more information. Hannah.
A very important update there. Thank you so much, Tori Larnett, for us there. Thank you, Tori. More people in Austin have the lights and the heat back on. This is the Austin Energy outage map, the latest. Right now it shows more than 22,000 people are without power. So we continue to see that number going down, hopefully throughout the day here. That is still a lot of people, though, that are in the cold and the dark right now. But this time yesterday, just to put it into perspective, 64,000 people were without power around this time. Now a closer look at the third emergency here, food supply shortage. Governor Greg Abbott said getting food to Texans in need is one of his top 5 priorities right now. This is video showing you what the shelves look like at local grocery stores. As of yesterday, a lot of food has been completely cleared out while stores wait for new items to come into stock. Yesterday, Governor Abbott mentioned how grocery stores might be able to get more supplies soon. And just like the past few days, HEB does plan to open from noon to 5 today in Central Texas, if stores, of course, have power to operate to do that. The grocery chain is putting limits on items to try to make sure there is enough to go around right now. But there are no guarantees with this because of a shortage, obviously, as we've been talking about. HEB is not fulfilling curbside or delivery orders there. And if you are in need of a hot meal, you're looking for one today, we are keeping an updated list of open restaurants on our website right now. You can just look for this article on KVUE.com. Let's go ahead and check in a live look here first. Well, not much is going on there, but as we can see, we're going to head over in a moment to Hunter. And Hunter, the sunshine is out today. It's been a very long week. I know our problems aren't going to go away at the drop of a hat, but at least seeing the sun melting that nasty ice off the roads, it's a start.
It's so great to see the sunshine back today. I know that Skycam didn't show much.
Yeah, what was going on there? It's fine.
We do have sunshine outside, and that paired with at least slightly warmer temperatures today, warming above freezing, that's going to go a long ways with starting to thaw things out. We're going to see a good bit of melting today. Across the Austin area, Camp Mabry, 33. The airport, 34. We've already warmed above freezing in many locations. And even for spots like Johnson City and Blanco that are currently below freezing, I think just about everybody will nudge above that freezing mark later on today. This is our radar and satellite. Very interesting. Now that the cloud cover is finally cleared out, that white that you see over Texas, that is not cloud cover. That is the snowpack that's being picked up by the visible satellite. But again, I suspect that by tomorrow, looking at that image, we'll still have sunshine, but we're going to see a whole lot less snow as that continues to melt today. So our highs, as warm as the 40s across the hill country. Austin, though, I still think it will be a bit of a struggle to get out of the 30s, but 39, that's several degrees above freezing. The coldest spots like Giddings and Cameron could be stuck in the mid-30s, but even then, we're looking at melting with temperatures above freezing. One last freeze is in the forecast for tonight and Saturday morning, but the afternoons as we headed to the weekend, those are trending warmer. So we're looking at 21 Saturday morning, 50 Saturday afternoon, Sunday around 60. We'll have another update of your forecast coming up in just a bit. We'll be back after the break.
Sponsored by Emerald Lawns. The grass really is greener.
Get more enjoyment from your outdoor space with patio enclosures. Right now, get 25% off your sunroom, plus no payments for 1 year. Virtual and in-home appointments available. Call today.
Patio enclosures.
Ever since we bought our new Suburban from Don Hewlett Chevrolet, I've just really enjoyed these romantic road trips. Just being here with you, me, the open road, and a ton of kids. Ooh.
Find new roads in Georgetown and at DonHewlett.com. Don Hewlett, Texas True.
Like a lot of you, I've suffered from many debilitating
Flew back to the Lone Star State and is now responding to outrage over his trip to Cancun during this weather emergency. ABC's Alex Perche shows us how the senator says he was just trying to be a good dad.
This morning, Senator Ted Cruz speaking out after facing backlash for escaping to Cancun, while millions of his Texas constituents fight the bitter cold without power.
In hindsight, I wouldn't have done it. I was trying to be a dad.
Cameras captured Cruz and his family boarding the flight from Houston to Mexico Wednesday. A wave of fury followed after pictures were posted online.
Yesterday, Senator Ted Cruz flew to Cancun. How do you feel about that?
He can stay there, actually.
The senator returned to the airport less than 24 hours later, this time with an armed escort. Cruz first seemed to indicate he was simply dropping his daughters off in Mexico and returning Thursday. But a source tells ABC News he was actually scheduled to return on Saturday with his family before changing his reservation.
I said yes because our kids wanted to do it, and this has been a tough year for kids across the state and across the country. And so school had been canceled. It was something that we could do, but at the same time, you're right. As a leader, you need to be here.
The New York Times reports it wasn't just Cruz's children pushing for the trip. The Times published what it says are text messages from Cruz's wife, Heidi, inviting neighbors to stay at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Cancun. Heidi reportedly texted the group that their house is freezing, asking anyone can or want to leave for the week. This morning, calls for Cruz to resign are growing louder from protesters outside his home and beyond. But he is finding support from Fox News host Sean Hannity.
I think you can be a father and be the senator of Texas all at the same time and make a round trip, quick drop-off trip and come home.
Well, Sean, that's right.
Cruz's past criticism of Democrats now resurfacing. In December, he criticized the mayor of Austin for traveling while urging people to stay at home. Alex Brachet, ABC News, Washington.
All right, and here's an incredible story of Texans helping Texans, something I've loved to see this week. For nearly a week, a grocery delivery driver has been living with complete strangers. Chelsea Simmons was delivering her last order of groceries on Sunday, and that is when her car got stuck due to the ice. Doug Condon and Nina Richardson tried to get it out, but it wasn't going anywhere, and apparently neither was Chelsea. The couple welcomed the delivery driver into their home.
I kind of come to them with an extra exit strategy every morning during breakfast, and every morning during breakfast they're just like, no, just stay. And then Doug, even this morning, he was like, look, you can do what you want, but you don't have to leave. Just don't feel pressured.
Very sweet. Love to see that. She said she's incredibly grateful for their kindness. She also said her apartment lost water and power, so she knows she was fortunate that Nina and Doug took her in. Certainly impacting all of us, Hunter. I've been sleeping at the station. I've been sleeping at a hotel. I've been kind of a traveling gypsy this week.
Yeah, there's just so many great stories like that also all around Central Texas. I saw a tweet yesterday where a lot of people from a neighborhood, obviously there's no plows here, they got together with shovels and they just shoveled out the big hill in their neighborhood. So many stories like that. We have warmer weather on the way, guys. This afternoon, we will warm above freezing. That with the sunshine is going to really help us out with the melting starting today. Here's our live look from our Oasis cam over Lake Travis. 34 degrees at the airport. We'll warm only into the upper 30s to low 40s today. But again, with that being above freezing, we're going to get some good melting. 35, the current temperature for Camp Mabry. Westlake at 34. Still a few spots like Lakeway, though, down to about 31. We had some 20s in our previous update, 32. It looks like now in Fredericksburg. There we go. Cameron still down at 29. But I think just about all of Central Texas will make it above freezing. This white that you see on our visible satellite, that is not cloud cover. No, that is snowpack being picked up by the visible satellite. But it will be sunshine today, upper 30s to low 40s for afternoon highs for most, maybe mid 30s though for areas to the north and east. As we go into tomorrow morning, one last hard freeze in the forecast. We're looking at 20s widespread, and then by the afternoon, trending warmer again with an afternoon high of around 50. And by Sunday, no freeze for the morning, 61 for the afternoon high. So Monday, 60 degrees behind a weak cold front, up to 72 on Wednesday. But the bottom line, warmer weather's on the way. That last freeze tomorrow morning. Then we have afternoons in the 70s by mid next week. Hannah.
I have never been happier to see that. I hope you guys are doing okay today. Stay safe out there in the roads as we watch this ice start to melt, and take care of yourselves. We'll see you here later tonight on KVUE.
Paid advertisement for legal services.
Nationally recognized lawyers.
Wainwright's got it.
A proven record of winning.
Wainwright's got it.
Call 888-8888. Respect, justice, demand it. Wainwright Injury Lawyers.
Roof leaking? Need a new roof? Call Jaycon at 512-479-0510. Roofing at its best with quality and pride since 1979. Jaycon Roofing, 512-479-0510.
Get a quote for high-quality new windows in as little as 5 minutes.